The thunder hit the burn ICU, and the man in bed 4 grabbed the rails so hard the steel groaned. 3 nurses had already failed, 2 residents, 1 attending surgeon. Nobody could touch Senior Chief Elijah Holt. Nobody could get close to the most decorated sniper in SEAL Team 5 without him shutting down completely. But the woman standing in the doorway didn't reach for the sedation button. She walked to his bed, put both hands on the rail beside his, leaned close, and whispered 2 words no one was supposed to know. His eyes flew open, his breathing stopped, his hands released. And the story of Francesca DeLuca began the only way it could, with a name buried in fire. Every morning at 5:15, before the sun cleared the Gulf of Mexico, before the first surgeon arrived, before the hydrotherapy suite began its constant hum of running water that gave the second floor of the Oleander Burn and Reconstructive Institute its particular white noise heartbeat, Frankie DeLuca was already at work. She stood at the supply cart outside the burn ICU on the 3rd floor, counting rolls of adaptic non-adhering gauze the way some people counted rosary beads. 4 rolls per patient. 16 patients in the unit. 64 rolls. She counted them by touch, her fingers brushing each one, confirming the texture, the weight, the tightness of the seal. She had been doing this for 11 years. She never thought about why she counted by touch instead of by sight. She never let herself think about that. The Oleander Burn and Reconstructive Institute sat on Seawall Boulevard in Galveston, Texas. 3 stories of glass and salt-weathered concrete facing the Gulf. On clear mornings, you could see the brown pelicans settling onto the pilings outside the BICU windows. Frankie had started a pelican census on a whiteboard by the nurses' station in 2014. It was the only thing in the building with her handwriting on it that she was proud of. The rest of her professional existence was careful, competent, and invisible. That was the plan. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant nobody looked too closely at the scars on her forearms. The splash burns from a phosphorus debridement she had performed 17 years ago, in a tent with no electricity, in a country she never talked about, on a man she had never stopped thinking about. Staff assumed the scars were from a kitchen accident. She let them assume. Correcting them would mean explaining, and explaining would mean remembering, and remembering would mean admitting that the bravest thing she had ever done was something her ex-husband had spent 5 years convincing her didn't matter. At 6:45, Carmen Delgado arrived, and the burn center came alive. Carmen was 53, Puerto Rican, born in Arecibo and raised in Houston, and she had been a burn nurse for 28 years. She was the only person at the Oleander who had ever seen Frankie smile without a patient in the room. "Morning, Frankie. You count the gauze already?" 64 rolls. "You ever take a morning off?" "The gauze doesn't count itself." Carmen set a coffee on the cart, black, no sugar, from the gas station on 61st Street, because the hospital cafeteria coffee tasted like someone had strained it through a mop. She had been bringing Frankie coffee every morning for 9 years. She had never once been asked. Some friendships are built on words. This one was built on caffeine and the understanding that certain people cannot ask for what they need. At 7, the day shift briefing began. 16 patients, 3 new admissions overnight, an offshore oil rig worker with 2nd-degree burns across his back from a steam pipe failure, a 3-year-old from a house fire in Texas City who was going to need grafting, and a naval aviator from NAS Corpus Christi who had walked into a jet exhaust wash during a flight line incident and would be discharged in a week if his face grafts held. Frankie took notes. She assigned beds. She reviewed pain management protocols and scheduled hydrotherapy rotations. She did this with the quiet precision of a woman who had once run a burn tent during a mortar attack and who now managed a civilian burn unit with the same discipline, the same attention to detail, the same refusal to cut a single corner, because every corner you cut in burn care was a piece of skin that wouldn't heal right. And she knew what that meant. She knew because she had been the one holding the scalpel. But no one at the Oleander knew that. And at 7:15, when Dr. Adrian Kessler walked into the briefing room with his coffee from the good machine in the surgeon's lounge, and his Yale ring, and his smile that never quite reached his eyes, Frankie did what she always did. She made herself smaller. Not physically. Frankie DeLuca was 5'4" and had never taken up much physical space. But there was a thing she did. A slight turning of the shoulders, a dropping of the chin, a withdrawal of presence, that made her disappear in a room where her ex-husband was breathing. She had learned this posture during the marriage, and 5 years after the divorce she still hadn't unlearned it. Kessler didn't look at her. He never looked at her during briefings. That was part of the design. He had told her once, during the worst year, that she was a competent pair of hands, and nothing more. He had said it while pouring wine at a dinner party, smiling at their guests, and no one had noticed her face. She had believed him. That was the part she couldn't forgive. Not what he had said, but that she had believed it. After the briefing, she walked to the BICU. She checked on the 3-year-old first, because she always checked on the children first, because somewhere deep in the architecture of her muscle memory there was a reflex that said, the children, then the operators, then everyone else. She didn't know where that reflex came from. She did. She just wouldn't name it. The morning passed. She changed dressings. She recalibrated pain management doses. She sat with the oil rig worker while he cried and told him that the itching was a good sign. That itching meant the nerves were waking up. That the worst part of healing was the part that felt like it was getting worse. She said this with such conviction that the man stopped crying. She said it because she believed it about everyone except herself. At 11:45, her phone buzzed. New admission. Military transfer from Mayville Medical Center, San Diego, burn ICU, arriving by air ambulance at 1300 hours. She checked the intake form. Patient, Holt, Elijah T. Rank, SCPO. Branch, USN. Unit, classified. Injury, 25% TBSA. Flash burns, bilateral hands, bilateral forearms, face, neck. Mechanism, training accident, CQB shoot house, NSWC, Coronado. Prior burn history, 38% TBSA, 2007, Iraq. Her fingers stopped moving on the tablet. Prior burn history, 2007, Iraq. 38% total body surface area. She knew those numbers. She knew them the way a surgeon knows the weight of a particular scalpel, not as data, but as sensation. She had felt those numbers under her hands in a field tent at Joint Base Balad, 17 marches ago, while the mortar rounds shook the walls and the generator was down, and she worked by headlamp and prayer, and the absolute refusal to let another operator die on her watch. She had saved a man with those numbers. She had lost his partner. She had never spoken about either. Frankie looked at the intake form again. Holt, Elijah T. SCPO. SEAL Team 5. Wraith. Her hands began to shake. She put the tablet down, walked to the staff bathroom, locked the door, pressed both palms flat against the cold tile wall, and breathed. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out. The same pattern she had taught a dying man in a burning tent in Ramadi. The same pattern no one at the Oleander Burn and Reconstructive Institute had ever seen her use. Because no one at the Oleander had ever seen Frankie DeLuca afraid. The air ambulance landed on the Oleander's rooftop helipad at 1:12 in the afternoon, and the man on the stretcher was the quietest critical patient Frankie had ever heard coming down the elevator. No screaming, no moaning, no crying. Burn patients scream. That's the thing civilians never understand about burns. The pain is not something you manage. It is something that manages you. It rewires your nervous system. It turns language into sound, and sound into noise, and noise into a frequency that every burn nurse carries home in the base of her skull for the rest of her career. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elijah Holt made no noise at all. He lay on the stretcher with his bandaged hands at his sides, and his gray eyes open and fixed on a point approximately 6 inches above the ceiling. And the only indication that he was alive was the controlled rhythm of his breathing. 4 in. Hold 4. 4 out. Frankie recognized the pattern from across the room. She recognized it because she had taught it to someone who looked very much like this man, 17 years ago, in a tent that smelled like phosphorus and diesel and the particular copper sweetness of burned human skin. She stood at the nurse's station and watched the transfer team settle him into bed 4. She watched 2 nurses approach to assess his vitals. She watched him turn his head toward them, slowly, the way a predator tracks movement, and say, in a voice so flat it could have been generated by a machine, "Don't touch me." The first nurse, a competent woman named Alicia, who had been in burn care for 6 years, took a step back. "Sir, we need to check your dressings and start your pain management protocol." I said, "Don't touch me. Sir, I will walk out of this building." He would. Frankie knew it. A man with 25% burns, who had been a SEAL for 18 years, would walk out of a burn center barefoot and bleeding before he would let someone he didn't trust put hands on the only tools that made him who he was. His hands. The hands that had held a rifle steady for 9 hours in a Ramadi rooftop hide while the temperature hit 130 degrees. The hands that had sent a round through a 6-inch window from 800 meters in a crosswind. The hands that were now wrapped in gauze and throbbing, and possibly, if the burns contracted wrong, finished. That was what no one in the room understood. This was not a man refusing treatment. This was a man guarding his identity. Over the next 3 hours, 3 more nurses tried. Then 2 residents, both calm, both professional, both trained in burn center patient psychology. Then Dr. Martin Orozco, the attending burn surgeon, who was excellent in patient, and who spent 11 minutes speaking softly about the importance of early intervention in hand burns, before Holt closed his eyes and simply stopped responding. At 4:30, Dr. Adrian Kessler entered the BICU. He had not been assigned to this case. He was a plastic and reconstructive surgeon, not an acute burn specialist. But word had traveled through the oleander, with the particular velocity that classified military patients always generated, and Kessler had done the math that Kessler always did. The math that calculated not a patient's needs but a surgeon's career. An active-duty Navy SEAL. Bilateral hand burns. High-profile training accident. This case would make a keynote presentation at the American Burn Association annual conference. This case would land in a journal. This case was worth 6 figures in professional capital. He pulled Frankie aside in the hallway. "Who's the primary nurse on 4? Alicia was assigned, but the patient is non-compliant. Non-compliant. Kessler said the word the way he said most clinical terms, as if the patient's suffering was a scheduling inconvenience. How long? 3 hours. He won't let anyone within arm's reach. I'll take the reconstruction, talk to Orozco about adding me to the surgical plan, and reassign the primary nurse. We need someone who can manage difficult military patients." He paused, looked at her. "Not you, obviously. You're a wound care nurse." He walked away before she could respond. That was also part of the design. Adrian Kessler never waited for Frankie DeLuca's responses, because he had decided 6 years ago that she didn't have anything worth saying. He had made this decision during their marriage, and had never revised it, because revising it would mean admitting that the woman he had diminished for 5 years was, in fact, extraordinary. And admitting that would mean confronting what he had done to her. And Adrian Kessler did not confront things that reflected poorly on Adrian Kessler. By 6 in the evening, Holt had removed his own IV line. By 7, he had refused his pain medication. By 8, the attending surgeon called an emergency nursing consult. 5 nurses in a conference room, trying to figure out how to treat a man who would not be treated. Carmen Delgado raised her hand. "Send Frankie." Silence. "She's the best burn nurse in this building," Carmen said. "She's been the best burn nurse in this building for 11 years. And whatever problem you think she has with difficult patients, I promise you she has dealt with worse." The charge nurse looked at Frankie. "Are you comfortable with a resistant military patient?" Frankie thought about a tent in ballad, a headlamp, a number 10 scalpel, a man whose skin was on fire and whose partner was dying 3 feet away. "I'll manage," she said. The BICU at night was a different country. The daytime version was clinical, efficient, optimized. Fluorescent lights, clipboard rhythms, the steady beep of monitors keeping time like a mechanical heartbeat. The nighttime version was darker, quieter, and more honest. At night, the Gulf of Mexico was a black expanse beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the only light came from the soft blue glow of the monitor screens and the navigation lights of shrimp boats working the channel. At night, the burn patients who were strong during the day let themselves feel what they were feeling. At night, the burn center smelled like Sylvadine cream and salt air and the faint, ineradicable sweetness of healing tissue, a smell Frankie had carried in her sinuses for 20 years, since her first day at the USAISR Burn Center at Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio, where she had been 21 years old and certain that nothing in the world could be as bad as what she was seeing. She had been wrong about that. The world had plenty worse. She had found it at Joint Base Balad, and it had followed her home. She entered Holt's room at 9:14 p.m. He was lying in the bed with his bandaged hands on his chest and his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. His monitor showed a heart rate of 62, absurdly calm for a man in significant pain who had refused all medication. His breathing was controlled. 4 in, hold 4, 4 out. She stood in the doorway for 10 seconds, studying him. The new burns, the shoot house flash burns, covered his hands, forearms, lower face, and neck. They were second and third degree, angry and raw beneath the gauze, and they needed treatment within the next 12 hours, or the window for preventing permanent contracture in his fingers would begin to shut. But beneath the new burns, on his torso and upper arms, visible at the edges of his hospital gown, she could see the old topography, the healed terrain of a 38% burn from 17 years ago. The particular texture of skin grafts that had been harvested from the thighs and applied to the torso, in the specific mosaic pattern used by the USAISR Burn Center's surgical team in 2007. A pattern she recognized because she had been the nurse who prepped the graft sites and monitored perfusion for 9 days straight while the patient was sedated and the mortars fell and the man in the next bed died. She knew this body, not this man. She had never seen his face, because he had been intubated and sedated the entire time. But she knew this body the way a sculptor knows a piece of clay she shaped years ago. Her hands remembered the angles. Her fingers remembered the depth of the burns. Her nervous system remembered the weight of the guilt. 2 patients, same night, same tent. One survived. One didn't. She had never been able to look at a 38% burn without hearing the sound of the other man's heart monitor going flat. A single, sustained tone that played in her memory every time she touched a piece of adaptic gauze. She closed the door behind her. Senior Chief Holt. His eyes moved to her, gray, steady, evaluating. The eyes of a man who had spent 18 years looking through a rifle scope. Eyes that categorized threats, measured distances, calculated when. "No," he said. "My name is Frankie DeLuca. I'm the senior burn critical care nurse at this facility. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I need to look at your hands." I said no. "I heard you." She pulled a chair to his bedside. She sat down. She did not reach for his hands. She did not reach for the chart. She did not reach for anything. She sat, and she looked at the old burn scars on his arms, and she did the thing that no other nurse in the building could have done, because no other nurse in the building had been in that tent. She leaned close, close enough that her voice wouldn't carry past the space between them, close enough that the words belonged only to him. "Wraith," she said, "stand down. You're in my burn center now." The sound he made was not a word. It was something before language, a catch in the throat, an involuntary inhalation, a seismic shift in the body's posture that happens when a human being hears a name they have been carrying like a stone and suddenly realizes they are not the only one carrying it. His hands released the bed rail. His eyes locked on her face. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows what those hands are worth. Let me work." Silence. 5 seconds. 10. The monitors beeped. The shrimp boats moved in the dark. "How do you know that name?" "I know a lot of things about you, Senior Chief. I know you were at Ramadi in 07. I know you were in a vehicle when an RPG hit the passenger side. I know you sustained 38% total body surface area burns, 2nd and 3rd degree, with phosphorus contamination. I know you were evacuated to a field tent at Joint Base Balad because the operating room was full. I know the generator was down. I know someone performed an emergency bilateral upper extremity escharotomy by headlamp while mortar rounds were hitting the wire." She paused. "I know because I was the one holding the scalpel." He stared at her. She could see it happening, the recalculation, the reassessment, the same targeting process that a sniper uses when the wind shifts and every variable changes and the mathematics must be recomputed in an instant. "The voice," he said. "What?" "That's what I call you. I never saw your face. I was sedated the whole time. But I remember a voice. Before the ketamine took me, a woman's voice that said, "You're going to make it. I'm not losing to." Frankie's breath caught. She had said those exact words. March 17th, 2007. 3:22 in the morning. She had said them because the man in the next bed, PO2 Tomas Sandman Reyes, 24 years old, 65% burns, phosphorus everywhere, had flatlined 12 minutes earlier, and she had performed CPR for 22 minutes, and his heart had never restarted. And she had turned from his body to the man on the other table, and made a promise with every cell in her body, not this one. Not him too. "You were looking for me," she said. It wasn't a question. 16 years, he said. "Your name was redacted from the classified after-action report. BAMC records from '07 were corrupted in a database migration in 2013. I went back to Ballad in 2012, and the tent was gone. You disappeared." "I didn't disappear. I just stopped being who I was." He looked at her scrubs, at her badge, at the absence of any insignia or award or indication that this woman had ever been anything other than a civilian nurse in a civilian burn center. Why? She didn't answer. She couldn't, because the answer was a man in this building, a man with a Yale ring and a surgeon's ego and a talent for making other people feel small, and explaining that would mean explaining everything, the marriage, the diminishment, the slow systematic destruction of every part of herself that had ever been brave, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Instead, she reached for his right hand. "May I?" He extended it. She began unwrapping the gauze, layer by layer, carefully, the way she had learned at BANC in 2004, when she was a second lieutenant in the Air Force Nurse Corps, and the attending surgeon had told her that unwrapping a burn dressing is a conversation between two nervous systems, the patient's and the nurse's, and the patient's system will either trust or reject based on the first 3 seconds of contact. Holt's system trusted. She examined the burns, 2nd degree across the dorsum of both hands, 3rd degree on 3 fingers of the right hand, 2 on the left. The flash pattern was consistent with a close-range accelerant ignition, exactly what a shoothouse malfunction would produce. Bad, but not career-ending. Not if the dressings were done right. Not if the debridement was clean. Not if the splinting maintained proper position. Not if someone who understood what a sniper's hands meant did the work. "Your hands are going to be fine," she said. He looked at her. "You can't know that." "I can, because I've seen worse. I've seen yours, 17 years ago, when they were worse. And you're still here." She began wrapping, 1 finger at a time. Adaptic non-adhering gauze first, maintaining precise interdigital spacing to prevent webbing contracture. Then the outer layer. Then the splint positioning. She worked the way she had always worked, with the particular patience of a woman who understands that burn care is not medicine performed on a body but a covenant between 2 people who have agreed that healing is possible. Holt watched her hands. He said nothing for a long time. Then, what was his name? She didn't ask who. "Sandman," she said. PO2 Tomas Reyes. El Paso, Texas, 24 years old. "I know his name. I light a candle for him every March 17th. I light 2 candles, 1 for Sandman, 1 for you." Her hands stopped moving for exactly 1 second. Then they resumed. "His last words," Holt said, "before the ketamine. He looked at me and he said, 'Tell Wraith I said check wind.'" Frankie closed her eyes. "Did you hear him say that?" "I heard everything that night," she whispered. "Everything." She finished wrapping his hands in silence. She adjusted the splints. She recalibrated his pain management to a protocol she had developed at BAMC in 2006. A protocol that was not in the Oleander's standard formulary because it had been published under someone else's name. She didn't mention that. She checked his monitors. She adjusted his bed angle. She turned toward the door. "Frankie." She stopped. "Thank you." She nodded without turning around. She walked out. She made it to the staff bathroom. She locked the door. She slid down the tile wall to the floor. And for the first time in 11 years, Frankie DeLuca touched the memorial bracelet under her watch band, the thin aluminum band stamped Reyes, Tomas A., P-O-2/U-S-N/March 17th, 2007/Ramadi, and let herself remember the weight of everything she had been told didn't matter. Over the next 4 days, Frankie treated Elijah Holt with the clinical precision of a woman who had learned burn care at the best facility in the Department of Defense, and the emotional distance of a woman who could not afford to feel what was happening. Because what was happening was that the man she had saved 17 years ago was lying in her burn center, and he was the first person in 16 years who had called her something other than the wound care nurse. And some part of her that had been locked in a dark room since 2012 was starting to bang on the door. She came every morning at 0600. She changed his dressings. She monitored his graft sites. She performed the hydrotherapy debridement that no other nurse would do because Holt would not allow anyone else's hands in the water with his. On day 3, he noticed the way she wrapped. "You're doing the fingers wrong." She looked at him. "Excuse me, wrong. I mean, not wrong. Not by civilian standards. But you're wrapping each finger individually with the gauze going distal to proximal before the outer layer. That's not standard protocol here. That's old school USAISR method. Pre-2011 revision." "I learned from a good teacher." "You learned at the institute." She didn't answer. "The burn center at BAMC," he said. "Brooke Army Medical Center, San Antonio." She adjusted the splint. "How long were you there?" "I was..." He let it go. He was a sniper. Snipers understood patience. They understood that some targets required hours of waiting before the shot presented itself, and that the worst thing you could do was force it. But he was watching her hands, and every time she touched him, every time she performed a procedure, every time she made a clinical decision, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Day 3, she adjusted his pain medication using a titration method he had only seen once before, at BAMC, in the burn ICU, from a nurse whose face he couldn't remember. Day 4, she performed a tangential excision on a section of third-degree burn on his right index finger, the trigger finger, the most important finger on his hand, with a speed and precision that made the attending surgeon stop what he was doing and watch. Day 4, 7 p.m. He asked her, "Where did you learn to tangential excise like that?" "Continuing education," she said. "That's not CE. That technique, the angle, the depth, the way you feather the edges, that's combat burn care. That's what they teach at the institute when they're training nurses for deployed surgical environments." She was quiet for a long time. "I had a good teacher," she said again. Then the thunderstorm hit. It came the way Gulf thunderstorms always come, fast, loud, and without apology. The sky turned from blue to purple to black in 11 minutes. The first lightning bolt split the air over the Gulf at 3:41 p.m. The first thunder hit the building at 3:43. The rain began at 3:45. Not rain, really, but a wall of water that turned the windows of the BICU into waterfalls and made the building shudder on its foundation. At 3:47, the overhead lights flickered, and Elijah Holt went back to Ramadi. It wasn't a choice. It was never a choice. The nervous system of a man who has been inside an explosion does not ask permission before it activates. It simply fires, like the weapon it has been trained to be, and suddenly the hospital room is gone, and the bed is gone, and the gauze is gone, and he is 23 years old, and the RPG is coming through the passenger window, and Sandman is screaming, and the fire is everywhere, and he cannot move his hands because his hands are on fire, and the world is noise and heat, and the absolute certainty that he is going to die in this vehicle, on this road, in this country, and no one will ever know what his hands were for. His heart rate hit 134. His blood pressure screamed 168/102. His bandaged hands seized the bed rails so hard the steel groaned. Frankie was in the room in 14 seconds. She had been at the nurse's station reviewing his graft schedule. She dropped the tablet and moved. Not ran, moved, because you do not run in a burn ICU. You move with purpose and control, because the patients are watching, and the patients will mirror your energy. And if you panic, they will panic, and panic in a burn ward is a thing that can kill. She entered the room. She did not touch the sedation button. She did not call for backup. She walked to his bed, placed both hands flat on the rail beside his, close enough that he could feel her presence, far enough that she was not restraining him. And she leaned close and said, in the exact cadence she had used in the ballad field 17 years ago, in the exact rhythm she had talked to a dying man in the dark. "Breathe with me. 4 in, hold 4. 4 out. You are not on fire. You are in Galveston. The water is 72 degrees. The pelicans are on the pilings." His breathing hitched. Again, he said through clenched teeth, 4 in, hold 4. 4 out. You are not on fire. His hands released the rail, one finger at a time. His breathing slowed. His heart rate began the long descent from 134 to 90 to 78. His eyes opened. He stared at her face. "Say that again." "Which part?" "You are not on fire. Say it the way you said it." She said it. The same cadence, the same tone, the same voice that had traveled through ketamine and pain and the chemical haze of a field anesthesia to plant itself in the memory of a man who had been, in that moment, closer to death than to anything else. "You were at Ballad," he said. "Spring '07, Tent 4. You're the one who cut me open when the generator went out." She didn't deny it. "I've been looking for you for 16 years. The rain hammered the windows. The lightning turned the Gulf white. The monitors beeped their steady mechanical reassurance. My name is Captain Francesca DeLuca," she said. "Air Force Nurse Corps, retired. I was assigned to the U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research Burn Center from 2004 to 2009. I deployed to the Air Force Theater Hospital at Joint Base Ballad from January to June 2007. On March 17th, I performed an emergency bilateral upper extremity escharotomy on you during a mortar attack, without power, using a headlamp and a number 10 scalpel. I was your primary burn nurse for 9 days until your evacuation to Landstuhl." She paused. "And I performed CPR on PO2 Tomas Reyes for 22 minutes before I stopped." Holt's eyes were wet. "You stopped because he was gone." "I stopped because he was gone, and because you were still here. And because I promised myself that if I could only save one of you, I would save you so completely that you would never doubt you were supposed to survive. I doubted it every day for 16 years. So did I." They sat in the darkened room while the storm raged outside and the Gulf churned against the seawall and the pelicans took shelter under the pilings. 2 people, 1 night, 16 years. A tent with no electricity and a man on fire, and a promise made in the dark by a woman who had spent every year since then being told that what she did in that tent was nothing special. The thunderstorm passed. The sun came out. And for the first time since she had walked into the Oleander Burn and Reconstructive Institute 11 years ago, Frankie DeLuca did not make herself smaller. Adrian Kessler filed the formal complaint on day 6. Frankie found out about it the way she found out about most of her ex-husband's maneuvers, not from him, not from the administration, but from Carmen, who heard it from the charge nurse, who heard it from the medical executive committee coordinator, who had been asked to schedule an emergency credentialing review. "He's saying you're using unauthorized protocols," Carmen said. They were in the supply room. Carmen's voice was quiet but her hands were shaking. "Military pain management techniques that aren't approved by the Oleander's Clinical Standards Committee. He's saying your training is, and I'm quoting, non-civilian in origin, and potentially dangerous when applied outside a military medical context." "My training." He pulled your military discharge documents from HR, said it was for credentialing purposes. He attached them to the complaint as evidence. Frankie leaned against the supply shelf. She closed her eyes. "He's trying to get me pulled from the case. He's trying to get your clinical privileges reviewed, which would pull you from every case. Because he wants Holt's reconstruction for his ABA conference keynote." Carmen didn't deny it. They both knew how Adrian Kessler operated. Every action had a career calculation behind it. Every patient was a publication. Every collie was either a tool or an obstacle. And Frankie had always been the obstacle he could move. "The committee meets Monday," Carmen said. "They've already put a temporary hold on your assignment to Bed 4. The float nurse is covering tonight." "The float nurse doesn't know burn hands." "I know. If someone wraps his fingers wrong, if the interdigital spacing is off by even a centimeter, the webbing will contract and he will never hold a rifle again." "I know, Frankie. He's a sniper. His hands are his whole life. I know. Frankie pressed her palms against the shelf. She felt the cold metal against the burn scars on her forearms. The scars from the phosphorus debridement. The scars she had let people believe were from a kitchen accident. The scars that were the only physical evidence on her body that Captain Francesca DeLuca had ever existed. What are you going to do? Carmen asked. Frankie opened her eyes. I don't know. But she did know. She knew with the certainty of a woman who had spent 5 years being told she was nothing, and 11 years believing it, and 16 years carrying a dead man's bracelet. She knew that Adrian Kessler was going to take this case from her, the way he had taken her confidence, and her name, and her rank, and her right to be proud of what she had survived. And she knew that she was going to let him. Because that was what she had always done. She had let him take the protocol she developed at BAMC and publish it under his name. She had let him tell dinner guests that she used to play soldier. She had let him delete her VA benefits paperwork. She had let him say, in the kitchen of their house in Galveston, while the Gulf wind rattled the windows, "You wrapped bandages in a tent. That's not medicine. That's first aid." And she had believed him. That night, the float nurse wrapped Holt's hands. The interdigital spacing was off by 4 millimeters. In burn care, 4 millimeters is the difference between full range of motion and a permanent claw deformity. Holt knew at the moment the gauze went on. He said nothing to the float nurse. He waited until she left. Then he removed the dressing himself, carefully, slowly, with the patience of a man who understands that his entire future exists in the gap between his index finger and his middle finger. And he sat in the dark holding his unwrapped hands over the edge of the bed and feeling the Galveston air on his raw skin and waiting for the woman who had promised him, 17 years ago, that she would not lose him. She didn't come. At 0300, the door opened. It was Carmen. She rewrapped his hands in silence, using the technique she had learned from watching Frankie. Not perfectly, not with Frankie's precision, but close enough. Close enough. Where is she? Holt asked. Home. She's been reassigned from your case. Why? Carmen hesitated. Her ex-husband filed a complaint about her clinical methods. He's a surgeon here. Holt was very still. Her ex-husband. Dr. Adrian Kessler, plastic and reconstructive surgery. The one who wants my case. Yes. He's her ex-husband. Yes. And he filed a complaint about her clinical methods. Yes. To get her removed from my care. That's one interpretation. What's the other interpretation? Carmen looked at him. That he's been doing this for 6 years. That he blocked her promotion twice. That he takes her cases. That he tells new residents she's rigid and mechanical. That he stole her burn protocol and published it under his name. That during their marriage he told her that her military service was playing soldier. That he said her work at Ballad was first aid, not medicine. She paused. And that she believed him. That's the worst part. She believed him. Holt's jaw tightened. In SERE training, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, there is a module on coercive control. It teaches operators to recognize the psychological techniques used by interrogators to break prisoners of war: isolation, diminishment, gaslighting, the systematic destruction of identity, the replacement of the prisoner's self-concept with the interrogator's version. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elijah Holt had taught that module for 3 years. He recognized every single pattern in what Carmen was describing. When's the committee meeting? He asked. Monday. I'm going to need a phone. They came on day 7. 4 men in civilian clothes, walking through the main entrance of the Oleander Burn and Reconstructive Institute, with the particular posture that military people recognize and civilians miss entirely, the squared shoulders, the measured stride, the constant environmental scanning that never quite turns off even in a hospital lobby, with oleander-patterned terrazzo floors and a Pelican census whiteboard. Lieutenant Commander Terrence Byrd, call sign, Torch, led the group. 34 years old, African-American, Annapolis, class of 2014, 16 years in Naval Special Warfare, SEAL Team 5 Platoon Commander, 6 years as a SERE instructor before transitioning to operational leadership. The kind of officer who made other officers feel like they hadn't earned their commissions. Behind him, PO1 Dante Marshall, books, Holt's sniper spotter, 27, African American. Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He had been sitting beside Holt's bed for 2 days, reading aloud from a paperback copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, because snipers understood that patience and vengeance were the same discipline. Behind him, 2 more operators whose names Frankie would never learn because SEAL team rosters are not public information, and these men did not introduce themselves by anything other than first names, Jay and Rico, which were almost certainly not their real names. They came because SEALs come for their own. Holt had made 1 phone call. The phone call had reached Bird at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. Bird had driven to the airport, chartered a flight to Houston, rented a car, and driven to Galveston in 14 hours. Because Senior Chief said come. That's all it takes. Bird found Frankie in the stairwell on the 2nd floor. She was sitting on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors, eating a granola bar, because the stairwell was the only place in the building where she could be invisible. Ms. DeLuca. She looked up, recognized the posture, recognized the bearing, recognized the look in his eyes, the look that military people give each other when they know. It's DeLuca, yes. I'm Lieutenant Commander Bird, SEAL Team 5, Senior Chief Holt's platoon commander. He paused. He told me what you did at Ballot. I did my job. He told me what your ex-husband did too. Frankie stopped chewing. With respect, Commander, that's not relevant to the Senior Chief's care. With respect, ma'am, it is. Because a surgeon at this hospital is using a fabricated complaint to remove the only qualified burn nurse from my operator's bedside, and he's doing it for career advancement. And the reason he can do it is because he spent 5 years dismantling your willingness to fight back. She stared at him. I've spent 6 years teaching SERE resistance training, Bird said. I teach operators how to survive interrogation, how to recognize when someone is using isolation, diminishment, and identity destruction to break them down. I teach them to spot the techniques, the deniable cruelty, the public charm, the systematic erasure of everything that makes you who you are. He sat down on the step beside her. I heard Dr. Kessler talking to you in the hallway yesterday. He said, I'm trying to protect you from yourself. You know what that is? That's a control statement. That's what an interrogator says to a prisoner right before they break them. I'm doing this for your own good. Frankie's hands were shaking. He's not. He is. And you know he is. You've known it for years. You just stopped trusting yourself enough to say it. Silence. I'm going to need your full name and military service number, Bird said. I'm contacting NCIS to pull your complete service record, and I'm requesting a meeting with the chief medical officer of this facility. Commander, the senior chief has not slept in 2 nights because someone wrapped his hands wrong, and he's afraid he's going to lose his trigger finger. The nurse who saved his life is sitting in a stairwell, eating a granola bar because her ex-husband filed a complaint to steal his case. And a man who published your burn protocol under his own name is telling this hospital that your military training makes you dangerous. He stood. I'm not going to let that stand. And neither are you. Because you are Captain Francesca DeLuca, United States Air Force Nurse Corps, and you performed an escharotomy under mortar fire with a headlamp and a 10-blade, and every operator who survived that burn tent at Ballot owes their hands to you. Including my senior chief. He extended his hand. She looked at it for a long time. Then she took it. The service record arrived from NCIS at 1400 hours on day 8. Bird hand-carried it to Dr. Miriam Okafor, the Oleander's chief medical officer, a Nigerian-American woman of 56 who had done her surgical residency at Emory and who did not suffer institutional nonsense of any kind. He placed the file on her desk alongside a 2-page written statement. Dr. Kessler's complaint is not about clinical standards, it is about control. I am trained to recognize the difference. I have observed a pattern of behavior consistent with coercive interpersonal manipulation, designed to isolate, discredit, and diminish a clinician whose military qualifications exceed most physicians at this facility. My patient's recovery depends on Captain DeLuca's care. I am formally requesting her reinstatement to his case. Dr. Okafor opened the service record. She reviewed it in silence. Captain Francesca N. DeLuca, USAFNC. Specialty, 46 and 3C, Burn Critical Care Nursing. Assigned, U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research Burn Center, Brooke Army Medical Center, Fort Sam Houston TX, 2004 to 2009. Deployed, Air Force Theater Hospital, Joint Base Balad, Iraq, January to June 2007. Air Force Commendation Medal with Valor Device. Citation. Captain DeLuca performed emergency bilateral upper extremity escharotomy on a critically burned special operations patient during active indirect fire attack, without electrical power, using only a headlamp and a number 10 scalpel. Her actions directly preserved limb viability and saved the patient's life. Dr. Okafor closed the file. She opened Kessler's complaint. She placed it beside the service record. She picked up her phone. "Get Dr. Kessler in my office. Now." The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Frankie was not present. She would learn what happened from Carmen, who would learn from the charge nurse, who would learn from Dr. Okafor's assistant. Dr. Okafor dismissed the complaint. She reinstated Frankie to Holt's case. She informed Dr. Kessler that his pattern of workplace conduct toward his former spouse was now the subject of a formal human resources investigation, effective immediately. Kessler stood in the doorway of the chief medical officer's office, and for the first time in the 6 years since the divorce, the composure cracked. "This is a professional matter," he said. "My personal history with Ms. DeLuca has no bearing." "Captain DeLuca," Dr. Okafor corrected. "Her rank is captain, and your personal history has every bearing, because you have used your position in this institution to systematically diminish a clinician whose military service record makes yours look like a summer internship." She held up the Valor citation. "She performs surgery under mortar fire. Doctor, what have you done that compares?" He didn't answer. He walked out of the office, down the hallway, past the BICU where Senior Chief Holt lay in bed 4 with his hands wrapped by a float nurse, past the nurse's station where Carmen Delgado sat watching him with the expression of a woman who had waited 6 years for this exact moment, and out the front door of the Oleander Burn and Reconstructive Institute. He called a headhunter from the parking lot. Frankie returned to Holt's room at 1600 on day 8. She found him in the bed with his hands extended over the edges, the float nurse's dressings removed, the raw skin exposed to the Galveston air. Brooks Marshall sat in the corner chair, the paperback face down on his knee, watching his chief with the quiet alertness of a man who has spent hundreds of hours in a sniper hide waiting for something to change. "You took the dressings off again," Frankie said. "They were wrong." "I know. The spacing was off. I know." She pulled on gloves. She opened a fresh pack of adaptic gauze. She sat down beside his bed. "I'm back," she said. "I know. I heard you in the hallway the whole time." She began unwrapping fresh gauze, one finger at a time. The USAISR method. Distal to proximal. Precise interdigital spacing. The technique she had learned at BAMC in 2006 from a surgical team that treated the worst burns in the Iraq War, in a facility that processed 300 catastrophically burned service members in 4 years, in a building where the walls were lined with photographs of the hands and faces they had saved. She had never stopped doing it this way. Not when she left the Air Force. Not when she married a man who called it first aid. Not when she spent 11 years in a civilian burn center pretending she had learned burn care from a textbook instead of from a war. Her hands knew what they knew. Her hands did not forget. Her hands were the only part of her that Adrian Kessler had never been able to change. "Wraith." "Yeah." Sandman's last words. Before the ketamine. He said, "Tell Wraith I said check wind." Holt's jaw tightened. His eyes closed. In the corner, Brooks Marshall set the paperback on the floor. "I never got to deliver the message," Frankie said. "I'm 16 years late, but I'm delivering it now." "What does it mean?" "You know what it means." He did. Check wind was sniper language. Check your calculations, verify your data, make sure you're accounting for all the variables before you take the shot. It was the last thing a spotter says to a shooter before the trigger pull. It was also, between partners who had spent 1,000 hours in a hide together, something else entirely. It meant, take care of yourself. It meant, I trust you to make the right call. It meant, I'm with you even when I'm not with you. "Check wind, Chief," Frankie said. "Your hands are going to be fine. I'm not losing you twice." She wrapped his fingers. one by one. Right hand first, the trigger finger, the index, the most important finger on his body. She wrapped it with the precision of a woman who understood that this piece of gauze, this angle, this spacing, this pressure was the difference between a sniper and a man with a disability. She wrapped the way she had always wrapped, the way BAMC taught her, the way the war taught her, the way no one at the Oleander had ever known she could wrap, because she had spent 11 years wrapping the way civilian protocol required, and not the way she had been trained to wrap. Not anymore. She finished. She checked the splints. She adjusted the elevation. Frankie. Yeah. I made some calls. BAMC old-timers. I asked around about the Air Force nurse who ran the burn tent at Ballot in '07. She went still. Every single one of them said the same name. She didn't turn around. Crucible. The word hit her like a mortar round. She hadn't heard it in 11 years. Not since the last time she stood in the BAMC burn center hallway and a Special Forces sergeant with graft scars on both arms had passed her and said, "Morning, Crucible." The way you say good morning to someone who saved your life. That's you. She turned toward the window. The Gulf was calm. The pelicans were on the pilings. The late afternoon sun was doing the thing it does in Galveston in April, turning the water from gray to gold and making the seawall look like it was built from amber. You saved my life with a headlamp and a 10-blade while mortars were hitting the wire, Holt said. You held Sandman for 22 minutes. You performed CPR until there was nothing left to perform it on. And then you went to the next stable, and you made a promise, and you kept it. His voice dropped. And then someone convinced you that wasn't enough. She pressed her hand against the window. She could feel the warmth of the glass. She could feel the memorial bracelet against her wrist. Reyes, Tomas A., the man she carried, the weight she bore, the name that no one at the Oleander had ever asked about because no one at the Oleander had ever looked closely enough to see it. Captain DeLuca, Holt said. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. She nodded. Once. She did not cry. She was not there yet. But she could feel it. The thing that was changing. The locked door inside her that had been rattling for 8 days was no longer rattling. It was open. Not wide open. Not yet. But open. She straightened her shoulders. She walked back to the nurse's station. Carmen looked up from her chart. You okay, Frankie? Yeah. She paused. Actually, my name is Captain Francesca DeLuca, Air Force Nurse Corps, and I'd like to update my credentials. Carmen stared at her for a long time. Then she smiled. About damn time. 3 weeks later, Dr. Adrian Kessler accepted a position at a burn center in Dubai. His resignation letter said, "I have accepted an exceptional international opportunity." He did not say goodbye. He did not apologize. He packed his office on a Sunday when the building was empty and left his parking pass on the security desk and drove to Houston Intercontinental and boarded a flight to a country where no one knew his name. His absence was the loudest thing he ever said to her. And for the first time, it was a relief instead of an abandonment. On day 14, Holt's hand graphs were holding. Range of motion testing showed 78% of baseline function, enough. His trigger finger flexed cleanly. The attending surgeon cleared him for rehabilitation and eventual return to duty. He would shoot again. In the rehabilitation gym, with the Gulf breeze coming through the open windows, and the compression garments on his forearms, and the mirror wall reflecting a man who was learning to look at his own scars without flinching, Holt held out his right hand. Frankie took it. Not a handshake, not a clinical assessment. A thank you that had been 16 years in the making. 2 candles, he said, every March 17th. One for Sandman, one for you. I didn't know about the second one. Now you do. Check wind, Crucible. She smiled. It was small. It was real. It was the first smile she had given anyone in the Oleander that wasn't attached to a patient reassurance. On Sunday, at 7:22 in the evening, she called Waterbury, Connecticut. Nana Rosa answered on the second ring. She always answered on the second ring. She had been answering on the second ring since 1963, when she arrived from Calabria and learned that in America the telephone was not a luxury, but a lifeline. Francesca, tutto ben? Nana, I have something to tell you. She told her everything. The Air Force, Ballad, the fire, Sandman, the hand she saved, the man she married who told her none of it mattered, the man she saved who walked back into her life and told her it was everything. Nana Rosa was quiet for a long time. Frankie could hear the television in the background, a game show, probably Wheel of Fortune, because Nana watched it every night at 7 and said the puzzle answers out loud in a mix of English and Italian. Then, chi ha il coraggio di ridere è padrone del mondo. The one who has the courage to laugh is master of the world. Nana, I'm not laughing yet. You will, tesoro, you will. Come home for Sunday dinner. Bring your appetite. I'm making braciole. Frankie hung up. She looked at the single photograph on her apartment wall. Nana Rosa's kitchen, Easter 1993, Waterbury, Connecticut. She was 11 years old. There was flour on her face. She was laughing. She was not there yet. But for the first time in 11 years, she could see it from here. She touched the memorial bracelet on her wrist. Reyes, Tomas A. She did not take it off. She would never take it off. But the weight had changed. It was not a punishment anymore. It was not a debt. It was a compass. It had always been a compass. And it had pointed her here. To a burn center on the Gulf. To a man whose hands she had saved twice. To a stairwell where a stranger in civilian clothes had seen what no one in her life had been willing to name. She opened her laptop. She navigated to the Department of Veterans Affairs Benefits portal. She entered her Social Security number. She had never enrolled. Adrian had deleted the paperwork years ago. She had never refiled. Because some part of her had believed him. Believed that her service wasn't real enough, wasn't medical enough, wasn't enough. She clicked enroll. It took 4 minutes. 11 years of silence. 4 minutes to end it. She closed the laptop. She looked at the photograph one more time. Then Captain Francesca Noel De Luca, Crucible, went to bed in her one-bedroom apartment on 25th Street, 4 blocks from the seawall, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not dream about fire. She dreamed about her grandmother's kitchen, and flour on her face, and the sound of laughing. Sometimes the fire that burns you down is not the one that falls from the sky. Sometimes it is the voice of the person who was supposed to love you most, telling you, in the kitchen, at the dinner table, in the quiet hours when no one else can hear, that the bravest thing you ever did was nothing special. And sometimes healing is not a single moment of revelation. It is a man in a hospital bed who has been searching for your hands for 16 years. It is a friend who brings coffee without being asked. It is a stranger in a stairwell who names the thing you could not name yourself. It is a grandmother 3 states away who says, in a language your grandfather brought across the ocean, the one who has the courage to laugh is master of the world. What Frankie De Luca discovered, what so many of us spend our lives learning and forgetting and learning again, is that the person who holds others together in the fire deserves someone willing to hold her together when the fire comes for her. And it always comes. And the hands that save are worth saving too. If this story reminded you that someone you know deserves to hear that what they did matters, share it with them today. Sometimes the words that change a life are not complicated. Sometimes they are as simple as, I've been looking for you. And you were enough. You were always enough. Before you go, think about the person in your life who held it together for everyone else. The nurse, the veteran, the friend who always answered the phone, but never made the call when they were the one falling apart. If this story made you think of them, share it with them. Not because we need the views, because they need the words. And if that person is you, hear me clearly. What you did matters. What you do matters. You are not invisible. If this story hit you, take 1 second and hit the like button. It helps more people find stories like this. Drop a comment and tell me, who's the Frankie in your life? If you want more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're here every day. Because the hands that save are worth saving too. Check wind, friends. I'll see you in the next one.